Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, History 105 Online, and today we're going to talk about life under the Ancien regime, or the ancient regime. And we're going to look at the time from about 1689 to 1789. So up to this point in the course, European society has changed little, had changed little from what it had been in the Middle Ages. A small circle of aristocrats still absorbed most of the wealth, while most of the people were poor peasants. Now, thanks to the commercial and financial revolutions that were mentioned last week, the middling orders of merchants and professionals were growing in numbers, wealth, and political savvy. Now, these groups would be key to the coming of revolution in European society and economic relations. And this lecture is going to concludes with an examination of basic issues of family formation, child rearing, education, lifestyles, and death rates in Europe before the French and Industrial Revolutions. Now, one simple way of conceptualizing the structure of European society in the 18th century is to think of a pyramid with a very broad base. At the apex of the pyramid stood a tiny proportion of the population, less than 3%, the landed aristocracy, though that proportion varied from country to country. Maybe 10% in Poland, 7 to 8% in Spain, 2% in Russia, and 1 to 2% in England. Now, this aristocracy is easy to define at the top, less so at the bottom. It included the titled nobility of dukes, marquises, or in German states, margraves, counts, or in Britain, earls, viscounts, and barons. Below these nobles in rank stood secondary aristocrats, without titles, including knights and gentry in Britain, seigneurs in France, hidalgos in Spain, and slatas in Poland. Now, some aristocrats without titles were as rich, if not richer, than many titled nobility. Other aristocrats were impoverished, especially Spanish hidalgos and Polish aristocrats. Theoretically, they came from very old families, but in reality, they frequently died out and were replenished from below. Now, the nature of aristocratic wealth was changing. As the century wore on, smart aristocrats, especially in Western Europe, diversified. Many held offices in the royal bureaucracies that had arisen to fight the wars of the 17th and 18th centuries, and many more invested in overseas trade and high finance. But in France and Spain, the law actually prohibited aristocrats from engaging in trade. Often the result was genteel poverty. Now, aristocratic wealth made possible a lifestyle marked by opulence, elegance, and display. Great aristocrats lived in great country houses and chateaux designed to show off their power. Now, lesser aristocrats and gentry lived in more a moderate splendor, different in scale, but not in kind. Yet, for half the year, October through May, with time at home for Christmas, great aristocrats spent their time at court in the great capitals of Europe. Some aristocrats had posts in government or sat in parliament in England or Ireland, and many aristocrats lived a dizzy life of entertainment and social obligations at court, Versailles in France, St. James in England, Sanssouci in Prussia, and Schönbrunn in Austria, at the theater and opera, or at salons. So that's the aristocracy. The middling orders included those with no titles, usually no lands, but they generally did not work with their hands and lived comfortable lives. They amounted to perhaps about 10% of the population and included merchants, financiers, and professionals. Merchants and financiers made money from overseas trade, internal trade, and investment. The most successful merchants rivaled the greatest aristocrats in wealth and might ape them by purchasing an estate in the country or even a title. Many merchants tried to break into the aristocracy by providing an endowed daughter to a poor aristocratic family. Others served as mayors, aldermen, or burghers in cities. Professionals included lawyers, doctors, military and naval officers, clergy, estate stewards, and majordomos. Small tradesmen were craftsmen, that is, small businessmen, made things and sold them in shops for lesser remuneration. Servants of all ranks were important in a world without automation. Now, peasants, perhaps about 3/4 to 4/5 of the population, did the work on great landed estates and smaller farms that made everyone else wealthy. In Russia, Poland, Austria, Hungary, and most German states, most peasants were serfs. These peasants were not free to leave the land by their own volition. They owned no land. Rather, they rented it by working a certain number of days per week on the land set aside for the landlord's crops. They survived by working the rest of the week to raise their own crops on the land that they rented. They were very much in their lord's power because he ran the local court and owned the only mill and oven in the town. In Russia and Prussia, the power of landlords grew thanks to royal attempts to gain landlord support for great military adventures. France's peasants, on the other hand, fared much better. Although there were still some serfs, most peasants in France were free and could leave the land. Most rented, but an increasing percentage owned their land. Still, they had to pay immense seigneurial duties or dues to grind grain in the landlord's mill, or bake bread in his oven, or crush grapes in his press. They had to work on roads for free for a specified number of days a year. They were inferior in law to nobles, and along with the middle class, the peasants bore the brunt of taxes. In short, the peasants in France could be quite prosperous, but a combination of bad harvests or war could wipe them out. Now, English peasants were best off. Some of the peasants were owners, but though most rented from a great landlord, many renters held their secure tenure and could not easily be thrown off the land. They were free, but losing some customary rights. Some were very prosperous, rivaling moderate gentry in wealth, and they were equal in legal rights to the greatest lord, in theory. Any peasant owning or renting land valued at £2 a year had a vote. And at the beginning of the century, peasants with a vote amounted to about 15% of the male population. The tax burden, however, was still pretty fair. Scottish and Irish peasants did not do so well. On the other hand, Scottish peasants were very poor, one step above serfs, and Irish peasants were worse off thanks to the penal code, which was mentioned last week. The most obvious and important thing that historians have found about private life is no surprise. Life was drastically different for the rich and the poor. Birth varied by class. Upper-class children were conceived early in young marriages when parents were in their late teens to provide as many heirs as possible. Middling and lower-class children were conceived in later marriages when their parents were in their mid-20s. The experience of childhood also varied by class. Upper-class children were not reared by their parents directly, but placed in the care of wet nurses, then, if male, tutors. Lower-class children were reared by their own parents. Education varied by class. Upper-class males were sent away. At a fairly young age, about 12 to 14, male children went to public or private and exclusive schools in England, Jesuit academies in France, or military academies in Prussia. At age 16 to 18, young upper-class men attended university, not so much for a liberal education as for polish and networking opportunities. They might skip this stage and take the grand tour of European capitals. They might make their debut at court in search of titles, lands, or a wife. Upper-class females were not generally given liberal educations in this period. Instead, they were taught domestic duties, that is, how to run a great household. Sooner or later, they went to court to seek a husband. Middling children saw growing opportunities. Males generally attended a well-endowed grammar or boarding school. The wealthiest male children could attend the same schools as the aristocracy, especially in England. Mercantile or craftsman children would pay tuition to serve an apprenticeship in the house of another merchant. Girls were sometimes allowed to attend school. Increased literacy made possible an intellectual life of novels and poetry. Generally, girls of this class were educated at home, similar to aristocrats. Often, like apprentices, they were farmed out to someone else's household for training as housewives. Peasants received little schooling. Some attended a basic parish school and learned to read and write. Most children of peasants were farmed out. Now, in general, in the West, the 18th century saw conditions improve for children with the end of swaddling clothes, greater emphasis on hygiene, fresh air, and even play, less corporal punishment, actual children's clothing, the first toy stores, and the first children's books. For example, the work by Tom Telescope, a pseudonym, called Newtonian System of Philosophy, adapted to the capacities of young gentlemen and ladies. Marriage and family formation were the most obvious areas of difference in aristocratic versus ordinary life. Aristocrats married young to partners chosen for them by their respective families on the basis of economic advantage. And as a result, aristocratic men were practically expected to find love elsewhere, with mistresses and prostitutes. Now, this led to a rational reaction in the 18th century, decrying arranged marriages. The middling orders experienced more freedom, but economic responsibilities meant that their choices were still limited by material circumstances and family advantage and opinions. Peasants could marry almost whomever they wanted because most had no property to lose. Now, offspring of the rational and scientific revolutions, better hygiene and food supply, gentler child rearing, slightly more education, and more emphasis on love and marriage contributed to a lower mortality rate in the 18th century. So this is the end of today's lecture on life under the Ancien regime. This is History 105 with Professor Hasselman.